What if the most lethal weapon on America's newest aircraft carrier isn't a missile, isn't a fighter jet, and never even appears in any promotional footage? You could watch the USS Gerald R Ford operate all day and completely miss it. But once you understand it, modern naval warfare will never look the same. Whenever the Navy unveils a new aircraft carrier, everyone fixates on the same things: its massive size, blistering speed, and how many jets can crowd the deck. Those specs photograph well, but they're not why aircraft carriers win wars. Carriers don't dominate because they arrive fast. They dominate because they refuse to slow down. The USS Gerald R. Ford carries a weapon that rarely makes headlines. It doesn't sit on the flight deck. It doesn't fire or launch anything spectacular. You could observe this ship for hours and never notice it. But once you do, everything changes. First, let's address the cost. The Ford class didn't come cheap, roughly $13 billion per ship. Factor in research and development, and that number climbs several billion higher. But what gets lost in those debates is what the Navy actually bought. This ship wasn't built to be bigger than its predecessors. It was built to behave differently. And here's the reality. No matter how powerful carriers have always looked, their effectiveness was always limited by something far less dramatic than enemy missiles or bad weather. They were limited by time. Every jet that launches has to return. Every jet that lands needs refueling, rearming, inspection, repositioning, and then launching again. Crews move ordnance, elevators cycle, deck space gets cleared and reused over hours and days. These steps determine how much air power a carrier actually delivers. That rhythm is called sortie generation, and it sets the ceiling on how much pressure a carrier can apply. A carrier with dozens of aircraft that launches them slowly becomes predictable. A carrier that keeps launching aircraft hour after hour becomes oppressive. The Navy didn't ask how fast the ship could go. Nuclear power solved that decades ago. They didn't ask how many aircraft could fit on deck. That was answered long ago. They asked something colder. How fast can this ship reload itself? How quickly can it recover aircraft, turn them around, and put them back into the fight without pause? And how long can it sustain that before people and machines fail? Those questions drove every major design choice on the Ford class. They explain why this ship looks familiar from a distance, but behaves very differently up close. In modern warfare, tempo decides who adapts and who reacts. The Ford class was designed to apply pressure without interruption. It runs past 30 knots, impressive for a ship this size. Nuclear propulsion lets it operate without fuel stops, but speed alone doesn't explain the difference. In real conflicts, carriers don't chase enemies like racing boats. They position themselves, establish operating areas, and cycle aircraft. That's where older carriers showed their limits. Previous classes weren't designed for sustained high-tempo operations that modern conflicts demand. The Ford class changes that equation completely. From the earliest design stages, the Navy treated sortie generation as a central requirement, not an afterthought. That meant rethinking how aircraft move, how weapons move, how people move, and how electricity flows across the ship. The Ford class generates far more electrical power than its predecessors to support systems that reduce friction everywhere else. More power means more automation. More automation means fewer delays. Fewer delays means more aircraft airborne over time. This is where the price tag starts making sense. The Ford class gets compared to other nations' carriers constantly, and the gap is enormous. Most of the world's carriers are smaller, conventionally powered, and built around far lower operational tempos. Some navies launch only a handful of aircraft at a time. Others rely on ski jump ramps that limit aircraft weight and payload. Even the most capable non-US carriers can't sustain the flight operations the Ford class handles. They were never meant to. Their strategic goals are different. Their budgets are smaller. Their doctrine accepts limits the U.S. Navy refuses. That comparison matters because the Ford class isn't just a ship. It's a statement about how America expects future wars to unfold. In a Pacific conflict, distance becomes a weapon. Bases are far apart. Replenishment windows are narrow. Aircraft have long transit times. Every delay compounds. A carrier that regenerates aircraft faster than its opponent can respond gains an advantage that's hard to counter without dramatic escalation. That advantage doesn't announce itself with explosions. It shows up when aircraft keep arriving after the enemy expects the deck to be empty. When defenses stay under constant pressure instead of short bursts. When pilots land, refuel, reload, and launch again while the opponent is still repairing damage from the last wave. This is why the Ford's most important capability is easy to overlook. It only becomes obvious after hours of sustained operations. The Navy knows this, which is why they're careful about discussing it publicly. Promising specific sortie numbers invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites criticism when reality doesn't match projections perfectly. The Ford program has faced technical hurdles, from new launch systems to weapons elevators that took longer than expected to mature. Those issues matter, especially in wartime. No ship is flawless. No system works exactly as advertised under combat conditions. But even critics agree. The Ford class represents a deliberate attempt to change how carriers fight, not just how they look. The ship was built to make sustained air power routine instead of exceptional. That shift has consequences that ripple far beyond the deck. It affects how many carriers the Navy needs to maintain presence in multiple regions. It affects how long a carrier can stay on station without relief. It affects how adversaries calculate risk and escalation. All of that stems from a capability that doesn't fire a shot. The USS Gerald R Ford carries 90 aircraft, but its real strength isn't how many jets it carries. It's how quickly it turns them into pressure, over and over again. Every carrier, no matter how advanced, lives or dies by how efficiently it moves people, fuel, weapons, and aircraft through a crowded space. The flight deck may look enormous, but in practice, it's one of the most congested workplaces on the planet. Every movement must be choreographed because mistakes cost time. Every bottleneck compounds. On older carriers, those bottlenecks were accepted as the price of doing business. Steam catapults dictated launch timing. Weapons elevators moved at fixed speeds. Deck crews worked around island placement that reflected decades-old design assumptions. When everything ran perfectly, the system worked. When it didn't, the pace slowed. And once it slowed, recovery was difficult. The Ford class was designed by people no longer willing to accept that. Instead of asking how to squeeze more effort out of crews, the Navy asked how to remove friction from the system itself. The result is a carrier that behaves less like a traditional warship and more like an industrial process optimized for throughput. That optimization starts with the most visible change. The Ford class replaced steam catapults with the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS. On paper, EMALS sounds like a technological flex: electromagnetic launch, linear motors, precise control. But EMALS wasn't built to look impressive. It exists to launch aircraft faster and more reliably than steam ever could. Steam systems require warm-up periods between launches. They stress aircraft airframes. They can't easily adjust launch power for different aircraft weights. EMALS eliminates those constraints. It launches aircraft back-to-back with minimal delay. It applies smoother, controlled force. It adapts instantly to whatever aircraft sits on the catapult. That flexibility translates directly into faster launch cycles, more aircraft airborne in less time. But launching is only half the equation. Recovering jets is where many carriers quietly lose time. Landing cycles stack up. Aircraft circle overhead burning fuel. Deck crews scramble to clear space. Small delays cascade into larger ones. The Ford class tackles this by rethinking deck flow. The ship's island, the tower housing command spaces and radar systems, was moved further aft. That change sounds minor, but it opens valuable deck space and alters how aircraft move between landing areas, parking spots, and catapults. Below deck, changes become even more consequential. Weapons movement has always been one of the slowest parts of carrier operations. Bombs and missiles are heavy, sensitive, and dangerous to move. The Ford class introduced advanced weapons elevators designed to move ordnance faster and more efficiently. These elevators were meant to be one of the ship's biggest contributors to improved operational tempo. Automation plays a critical role here. The Ford class carries fewer sailors than previous carriers, even though it's larger and more complex. That reduction wasn't achieved by asking people to work harder. It was achieved by designing systems that require fewer hands to operate and maintain. All these changes point in the same direction: faster launches, faster recoveries, faster weapons handling, less friction between steps. There's no single moment where the ship reveals its power. Instead, the advantage accumulates quietly, hour by hour. This is where that $13 billion price tag begins to look different. It sounds outrageous when you imagine a ship sitting at sea doing nothing. It sounds less outrageous when you consider what the Navy expects that ship to do over decades of service. Most navies worldwide don't operate carriers like this. Many operate them as symbols of national power or regional influence. Their carriers launch fewer aircraft, less frequently, and for shorter durations. That's not a flaw, it reflects different strategic goals. The U.S. Navy expects its carriers to serve as mobile air bases capable of sustained combat operations far from home. That expectation drives everything about their design. The Ford class pushes that expectation further than any carrier before it. But all this engineering serves one purpose: to protect something fragile, the pace of operations. Because once a carrier slows down, it becomes predictable. Once predictable, it becomes manageable. Once manageable, its deterrent value erodes. The Ford class exists to delay that moment as long as possible. To understand why this carrier changes everything, you have to stop looking at it as a ship and start seeing it as a signal. In a Pacific conflict, distance is a weapon. Bases are separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. Replenishment takes time. Aircraft spend long periods in transit. Every sortie becomes more expensive in fuel, maintenance, and crew fatigue. In that environment, pauses are dangerous. If a carrier slows down to reset, the opponent gains space to disperse assets, repair damage, reposition defenses, or wait for political pressure. A carrier that maintains tempo denies that space. In high-end conflict scenarios, analysts talk about windows to strike, to resupply, to exploit advantages. These windows are measured in hours, not days. A carrier that regenerates aircraft faster effectively shortens those windows for the other side. That changes how risk is calculated. The question becomes whether they can absorb sustained pressure without time to regroup. That's far more uncomfortable than dealing with short bursts followed by lulls. This is why the Ford class has drawn attention from planners focused on China. China's naval strategy emphasizes layered defenses, long-range missiles, and the ability to complicate carrier operations far from shore. The goal isn't necessarily to sink carriers outright, but to make operating them costly enough that their presence becomes politically and militarily difficult to sustain. In that context, tempo matters as much as survivability. A carrier that keeps launching aircraft forces defenses to stay active. Active defenses reveal themselves, consume resources, and exhaust crews. Over time, the burden shifts. Sustained pressure wears down even sophisticated systems, not because they're poorly designed, but because they're operated by humans with limits. The secret weapon is sortie generation rate. For the Ford class, the Navy's target is 160 sorties per day during normal operations, with the ability to surge to 270 sorties in 24 hours. Those aren't marketing taglines. They're design goals that shape the ship from the keel up. Yes, the Ford class is expensive. Yes, Development was rocky. Yes, early systems had problems critics were right to question, but the Navy wasn't paying $13 billion for a prettier Nimitz class. They were paying to change how carriers behave under stress. The most powerful weapon on a modern aircraft carrier isn't what it fires. It's how often it can fire and how long it can keep doing it when everyone expects it to stop. That's the secret weapon, and it's already shaping how the next war will be planned. So let me ask you, if you were building the next generation of carriers, would you spend the money on flash or on endurance? Would you chase spectacle, or would you design for the long grind? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want to support Military Insider and help us keep telling these real naval stories, join the fleet by clicking the Join button. It helps us dig deeper without watering anything down. Thanks for watching. More stories like this coming soon. I'll see you in the next one.